Part 40. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wu Nian. Chapter 391. For Chen Tao, Nia's special skin looks very good. In the aesthetics of the Earthlings, Nia is a first-class beauty. But among those fox people, she is like a monster. For a long time, Nia has been treated as a monster by the people in the tribe. Except for Nia's parents, who raised Nia gently and brought her up, everyone else in the tribe regarded Nia as a monster. Nia has always been excluded in the tribe and has almost no one around her. Later, she met Yanni. Nia looked at the warrior flower under the abyss. That flower is actually the proof of a warrior, and it is also the way for the powerful men in the tribe to pursue women. Only when the opposite sex takes this warrior flower and gives it to the opposite sex they like, then the opposite sex will feel very honored and happy. A woman who takes the warrior flower is equivalent to accepting the courtship of the opposite sex. And a woman who gets the warrior flower means becoming a warrior's woman. In this way, she can have a lot of glory and can be respected by people in the tribe. However, Nia knows very well that it is impossible for her. Because the warrior flower can only be picked by the top warriors in the tribe. It feels so difficult for us, Yanni complained weakly. Yes, only the top warriors in the tribe, the warriors who are recognized as the most powerful, can pick the warrior flower on this extremely steep cliff wall. Because the place where the warrior flower grows is very difficult to touch, only the most powerful warriors can pick it. And the woman who gets the warrior flower is admired by others. For Nia, as a monster, it is impossible for her to get this kind of thing. Somewhat powerless, but this is the fact. Roar. Suddenly, at this moment, a low beast roar brought the two women standing next to the abyss back to their senses. Nia subconsciously turned her head and looked behind her. The scene she saw made Nia's expression change. What is this? Behind Nia, a completely black leopard was staring at Yanni and Nia. Seeing this, Nia's face turned pale. It is common to encounter wild animals in this forest. Nia often hears about people being taken away by wild animals in the tribe. Nia and Yanni have to go into the forest to pick wild vegetables and fruits. However, Nia and Yanni have been outside for half a year, and they have not encountered any in the past 6 months. They thought they would never encounter any. But unexpectedly, they still encountered them. She suppressed her inner fear and looked at Yanni beside her. Yanni's little face turned pale, her big eyes were full of tears, and her nervous look was all seen by Nia. Nia bit her lip and said, "Yanni, run, I will stop it." Yanni was startled, and she looked at Nia. Nia hurriedly took a step forward and stopped Yanni behind her. She stared at the leopard's eyes and said, "Run quickly. If you don't run now, it will be too late. I heard that wild animals will not chase others after they kill and eat. If I stop it, it will finish eating. As long as you leave before it finishes eating me, you will be fine." Yanni was stunned. She looked at Nia blankly. "Nia. Yanni, in the tribe, you are the only one who talks to me and works with me." Nia bit her thin lips and said, "No matter what, I will not allow you to die." Yanni bit her thin lips when she heard it, and she looked at the leopard with a black body. "Run!" Nia shouted. Yanni wanted to run a long time ago because of fear, but she knew that she could not outrun the leopard, so she did not run immediately. But now she was a little confused when she heard Nia's words. Hearing Nia shouting to run again, Yanni took a step forward, and as soon as she took a step, she ran. Yanni cried as she ran, "Nia!" The leopard glanced at Yanni, who was running away, and his eyes fell on Nia. It risked its body and pounced on Nia. Nia's face was as pale as paper. Everything was over. But, what does it matter? Nia had infinite fear in her heart, but she felt relieved when she realized that she was going to die. Nia was a monster, and in the eyes of the tribe, she was a monster. She was alienated and driven away like a monster, and she was considered unlucky. Nia felt that she was an alien in this life, and it was useless to live. If she died, she could still save her companions. For Nia, it was worth it. Nia watched the leopard flying over, her eyelashes trembled, and she slowly closed her eyes. Bang! Suddenly, there was a muffled sound. Ah! Accompanied by a scream. Nia could feel a gust of wind passing by. She subconsciously opened her eyes and caught a glimpse of the flying shadow. She looked over there and saw the shadow hit the opposite wall with a bang. Now Nia could see clearly that it was the leopard. After the leopard hit the wall, its body fell down and fell into the abyss. Ah! A leopard's cry sounded. The leopard disappeared, but Nia was a little confused. What happened? Nia subconsciously looked forward. At a glance, Nia found a person standing in front of her. A weirdo. Nia blinked subconsciously. This was a man, and this man was wearing clothes she had never seen before, and the man had fair skin. No ears and no tail. Nia blinked subconsciously, her expression was a little more confused, and she felt strange in her heart. Was the beast knocked away by this man? Nia's brain was a little frozen, and she was a little unable to think. Chen Tao looked at Nia, who was stunned. To be honest, Chen Tao didn't intend to save people at first, but looking at the picture, looking at Nia's choice to sacrifice to save her friends, Chen Tao really couldn't bear it, so he took action. Looking at the girl in front of him, Chen Tao showed a gentle smile and said, "Are you okay?" Nia was startled. She looked at Chen Tao, she nodded slightly, and said, "It's okay, I didn't see what happened just now, it should be you who saved me." "Thank you, you are Nia's benefactor." Her voice is quite nice, crisp and pleasant. Chen Tao smiled and said, "I was just passing by." "What are you doing here?" Nia was slightly startled. She said, "I am collecting wild vegetables and fruits to eat." Nia pursed her thin lips, looked at Chen Tao strangely, and said, Are you from there?" "I feel that you look so strange, sorry, I have no ill intentions." Nia seemed to be afraid that her words would offend Chen Tao. When she said the last part, she couldn't help but bow her head to apologize. Looking at Nia's somewhat delicate appearance, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't worry, where I come from is not that important." Chen Tao raised his hand, and there was a blue flower in his hand. He sent the flower to Nia and said with a smile, "The important thing is that I met you. Come, this flower is for you." Nia was startled. She looked at the flower in Chen Tao's hand, and her eyes trembled slightly. "This is the warrior flower. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 392. Looking at the warrior flower so close in front of her, the girl Nia opened her mouth slightly and covered her mouth with her little hand. Her expression was a little more surprised. Warrior flowers, without exception, all grow on the steep cliffs of the abyss. If you want to pluck the flower of warriors, only a true brave can do it. This kind of flower is what many girls in the Nia tribe dream about. But now this strangely dressed man in front of her wants to hand her a warrior's flower? Nia's eyes trembled slightly, with a glimmer of disbelief. She subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. "You want to give me the warrior's flower?" Chen Tao looked at Nia and said with a smile, "I can see that you like her very much. Since I have the chance to meet you, of course I have to give you a gift." It can be seen that Nia likes this thing very much, but Chen Tao does not understand what this thing represents. He just thought the girl liked it, so he took it off and gave it to her. "You don't like it?" Chen Tao couldn't help but look at Nia when he saw that Nia didn't take it. Nia's eyes trembled slightly, with a hint of mist in them. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Can I?" Chen Tao was slightly startled. "What?" Nia wiped away her tears and looked at Chen Tao. "Can a monster like me really be treated like this?" The biggest dream of girls in the tribe is for someone to risk their lives to pick a warrior flower and then give it to her. Giving the warrior flower to a girl represents courtship in Nia's tribe. And when Nia was in the tribe, she was treated like a monster, but now a man presented her with a warrior flower that symbolized supreme glory and made love to her. Nia's emotions suddenly became a little difficult to control. Nia wiped the tears from her eyes, raised her face, and looked at Chen Tao with her steamy eyes. Eyes facing each other. So beautiful, this face. Nia's skin is very fair, smooth, and delicate, like gelatin, slightly blue, but it does not damage Nia's beauty at all, but adds an exotic charm to her. She was wearing only thin animal skins. When two pieces of animal skins were attached to her body, they were considered as clothes. But in this way, her tall and voluptuous figure could no longer be hidden. The upper body holds the fabric high up, and under the animal skin below, the legs are slender and straight. Her hot figure, coupled with her natural ears and tail and her natural blue blood, add a bit of exotic style. It's just that Nia's eyes were filled with mist, and she looked at Chen Tao with overwhelmed emotions. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he smiled. They say you are a monster, but I don't think you are a monster. On the contrary, I think you are very cute. Compared to those who think you are a monster, you are much cuter. Hearing Chen Tao's praise, Nia was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao, and her eyes fell on the blue flower in front of her. She raised her little hand and took the blue flower. Looking at Chen Tao with his eyes, his face turned red and blue. After taking the flower, she held it carefully in her arms. She looked at Chen Tao and met Chen Tao's gaze. Nia slowly lowered her head, with a faint smile on her face, looking very shy. It looks quite pleasant. Rustle. Suddenly, footsteps sounded outside. It's over there, it's over there. Hurry up, an anxious voice came from the other side. Nia was slightly startled, it's Yanni's voice. Chen Tao looked in the direction Nia was looking. With the sound of rustling, a group of people walked out of the forest. Chen Tao took a look and saw that it was Yanni. As soon as Yanni saw Nia, her eyes suddenly lit up. She hurriedly ran to Nia. Her little face was full of tears and stains. She wiped the tears with her little hands and choked out, I thought I'll never see you again. Nia looked at Yanni who was crying so hard that she blinked her eyes and said, I'm fine. Nia raised her hand and wiped the tears from Yanni's face. Yanni's figure is smaller than Nia's, and her skin is also dark blue. Nia is much taller than Yanni. Yanni suddenly, a voice sounded. Yanni was startled and looked behind her. Behind Yanni were 5 men with dark blue skin and furry ears. These men are tall and have dark blue skin all over their bodies, but they are obviously much bullier than Nia and the others. One of the leading men, with his eyebrows furrowed, looked at Yanni and said, you just said that people in our tribe were attacked by wild beasts. Is she the tribe member you are talking about? He pointed at Nia. Yanni was startled, and then she said, it's Nia, that's right. When the man heard this, his face darkened and he said, you actually asked us to put down the prey we were about to get to save this monster. Listening to the man directly saying that he was a monster, Nia's face turned slightly pale. The touch and joy that Yanni was worried about disappeared all of a sudden. She looked a little more depressed. Yanni frowned, Nia is not a monster, she is a member of the tribe like us and is my companion. When Nia heard this, she looked at Yanni, her eyes glowing with a hint of luster. Companion? Who is her companion? The man frowned and said, a guy who looks completely different from us. If this kind of person stays in the tribe, it is very likely to bring bad luck to the tribe. If Untu hadn't wanted to keep her, we would have driven her out of the tribe long ago. What about companions? Yanni frowned, she just looks different from us, but Nia is a good person, you can't say she is a monster because of this. The man snorted, what a waste of time, Yanni, stay away from her in the end, otherwise, you will also be regarded as a monster, and it will be too late to regret it. Yanni said, Ted, listen, Nia is my companion, people are recognized companions. I say, she is not a monster. As she spoke, she puffed up her cheeks with anger. Chen Tao was watching the scene from the side. Looking at Yanni's angry look, he found that the girl's personality was also quite cute. Ted was too lazy to say more to Yanni. He turned his eyes and fell on Nia. Ted frowned slightly and said, What are you holding in your hand? Nia was slightly startled. She looked at the blue flower in her hand, and her eyes were shining. It's the warrior flower. Someone recognized the name of the flower. Warrior flower? Is that possible? Who gave it to her? Yanni's eyes lit up, and she looked at Nia and said, Warrior flower, it's really a warrior flower. Nia, where did you get it? Yanni was also very curious. Nia blushed slightly. Ted crossed his arms, looked at Nia strangely, and said, Where did you get it from? Ted's question was not so polite. Nia subconsciously looked at Chen Tao next to her. At this moment, everyone's attention was also on Chen Tao next to her. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 393. Chen Tao smiled slightly, hello. Ted looked a little more puzzled. He frowned and looked at Chen Tao. Ted looked at Chen Tao, the same monster as Nia? However, you look more like a monster than Nia. Is it you who gave the warrior's flower to Nia? Ted squinted his blue eyes and stared at Chen Tao with a trace of disdain. Chen Tao said, Well, it's me. Ted curled his lips and said, It's really you, haha, just you? A monster handed a warrior flower to another monster. I'm afraid your warrior flower was picked up from somewhere. Bar. Ted. You are going too far. Yanni stood up and stood in front of Ted. She frowned and puffed up her cheeks in anger. She stared at Ted and said, If you can pick the flower of the warrior, that's what the warriors do. You should respect him. Ted said, Our tribe does respect warriors. If you pick up warrior flowers on the ground, you are not a warrior. He stared at Chen Tao. A person appeared out of nowhere. He looked suspicious, had a different skin color, and had no ears and tail. He was completely different from us. Of course, my tribe respects warriors. As long as you are truly a warrior, even if you look like a monster, of course we respect you. But I said, I will not respect a warrior's flower picked up from the ground. Ted looked at Chen Tao and said, Unless you can pick a warrior's flower in front of me. Chen Tao looked at Ted and said, I think besides picking the flowers of warriors, there is another way to prove whether I am a warrior. Ted squinted his eyes, looked at Chen Tao, and said, What can I do? Chen Tao crossed his chest with his hands, looked at the man with dark blue skin in front of him, and said with a smile, Let's have a fight. If I win, you will recognize me. When Ted heard this, his expression darkened. You want to challenge me? It's really interesting, just you. Ted stepped out and stared at Chen Tao, his eyes full of anger. Ted looked down on the strange-looking Chen Tao. In Ted's view, Chen Tao was a monster and a low-level person. And this lowly man dared to challenge him. This is looking down on him. Ted was very upset. Ted handed the spear in his hand to his companion. As soon as he handed it away, he stared at Chen Tao. Okay, I accept your challenge. If you win, I admit you. Because you can't win. Ted stepped forward and rushed towards Chen Tao. Compared to ordinary people, Ted's speed is amazing. But the problem is that Ted met Chen Tao. Bang. There was a muffled sound. Ted's voice flew out like a cannonball. Boom, Ted's body hit the tree trunk hard. The tree trunk trembled slightly and the leaves slowly fell. Ted fell to the ground, dazed. For a moment, everyone on the field was stunned. Among them are Nia and Yanni. Both women were stunned. Although Ted is annoying, he can be regarded as a real hunter. You should know that he often follows the hunting team to hunt wild animals outside. Such a young and strong hunter was actually kicked 3 meters away by the man in front of him. Too exaggerated. Nia looked at Chen Tao with a slight change in her eyes, a hint of obsession in her eyes, and she held the warrior's flower in her hand a little harder. Ted struggled to get up with his hands on his stomach. He looked ugly and looked at Chen Tao with a hint of surprise. Chen Tao looked at Ted, crossed his arms over his chest, and said with a smile, "So, how about it?" Ted looked at Chen Tao. He gritted his teeth and looked at Chen Tao, "So what if you beat me? I'm just a hunter. A real warrior is someone who can go into the abyss to pick the flower of warriors. Can you?" Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Shameless Yanni suddenly said, "Ted, do you not even want the glory of the tribe?" Yanni stared at Ted and said, "After we agreed on the challenge, if you lose, you have to admit Chen Tao. Now that you are saying this, are you not afraid that people in other tribes will know about it? You don't want to face it already?" Ted frowned sharply. "What did I say that I didn't recognize him? Yes, of course he can admit that he is a warrior." Ted stared at Chen Tao with squinted eyes and said, "However, my admission does not mean that others will admit it. I just picked up the warrior flower from nowhere. How can I want people to admit that he is a warrior?" Chen Tao looked at Ted. Although Ted said he admitted, Chen Tao could see that Ted was not convinced. Chen Tao said, "Okay, since you want to see it, let you see it." After the words fell, Chen Tao raised his hand. He raised his hand. Ted didn't know what Chen Tao was talking about, and he was a little confused. At this moment, Ted saw movement nearby from the corner of his eye. He looked over there. Over there was the abyss where the warrior flower grew, and at this moment, a blue warrior flower flew up from the abyss. This scene was particularly strange. Those warrior flowers seemed to be held by an invisible force and flew into the air. Everyone around them stared. The blue flower, pulled by an invisible force, fell into Chen Tao's palm. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Nia. Nia had flowers in her hand, and it would not be good to give them to her again. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Yanni beside him, who was looking directly at the flowers in Chen Tao's hand. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled, and pushed his hand slightly, and the flower flew out and flew in front of Yanni. Yanni was slightly startled, and she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "For you." Yanni was stunned. She hesitated a little, with a smile on her face, raised her little hand, took the flower, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "I accept it." Chen Tao nodded slightly, and his eyes fell on Ted beside him again, saying, "Now you see it too." Ted's face was full of surprise and disbelief. He looked at Chen Tao. How did you do it?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he said, "I don't think I need to tell you." Ted was silent for a while. He nodded slightly, and said, "Well, I admit you are a powerful warrior." As he said that, Ted raised his hand, saluted Chen Tao, and said, "We will continue hunting next, goodbye." He turned around and left with the people. Watching Ted walk away, Yanni said, "Huh, this Ted is really annoying, and his words are really rude." Chen Tao looked at Yanni, who was petite, about 1.5 meters tall, but had a good figure. After complaining, Yanni looked at Chen Tao and smiled, "Where are you from?" Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed. He looked at Yanni and said with a smile, "This question shouldn't be that important, right?" Yanni pursed her lips, looked at Chen Tao and said, "I'm yours now, I want to know more about you. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 394. Yanni's words made Chen Tao confused. Ah, Chen Tao was stunned. You are my person. What does it mean? Chen Tao has no idea what Yanni means. When did Yanni become his person? Chen Tao just played too much with Betty, Betty was exhausted, and Chen Tao was bored. So he looked at the civilization and customs of this world. Later, because of Nia's specialness, he paid more attention to it, and these things happened. Chen Tao, who was soft-hearted for a while, saved Nia and knew that Nia wanted this flower, so he gave it to her. And because Ted looked down on her, Chen Tao picked another one. Nia already had one, so he gave it to Yanni. Chen Tao thought about these things carefully. He felt that he had not done anything strange. How could there be an extra girl inexplicably? Looking at Chen Tao's puzzled look, Yanni blinked her eyes and said, don't you know the meaning of the warrior flower? Warrior flower. Chen Tao looked at the flower in Yanni's little hand, he looked at Yanni and said, isn't this the name of the flower? Nia said it. What's wrong? Yanni pursed her slightly blue thin lips and looked at Chen Tao. You really don't know? Giving the warrior flower to a girl is like courting a girl. I accepted it, which means I accepted your courtship. Then, I am yours. Chen Tao's eyes widened. Sorry, I don't know the meaning of this thing. This is not easy to deal with. However, it should be okay, this matter can probably be saved. Thinking about it, Chen Tao looked at Nia next to him. Nia lowered her head slightly and didn't look at Chen Tao, but Chen Tao could see that Nia was a little depressed. It seemed that she realized that Chen Tao didn't know the meaning of the warrior flower and knew that Chen Tao didn't mean to court her, which made Nia feel bad. But seeing Nia like this, she shouldn't embarrass herself. This matter seems to have a turning point. Chen Tao came here to help people. He didn't plan to come here and take the two girls back in a few minutes. Yanni's eyes were shining, and she showed a playful smile and said, I don't care. This is the custom of our tribe. You handed the warrior flower to us on our tribe's territory, so you can't take it back. And we should be your people. Whatever you want, that's it? Chen Tao was stunned when he heard it. He didn't expect Yanni to do this. However, from the character Yanni showed at the beginning, Chen Tao could judge that Yanni was a very innocent and playful girl. According to her character, it was not surprising that she would be like this. However, Nia should be different. Thinking of this, Chen Tao looked at Nia, and Nia was looking at this side. Now it happened to meet Chen Tao's side. Nia was slightly startled, she looked at Chen Tao, and didn't say anything. Chen Tao said, then, what about Nia? Nia pursed her lips and slowly held the blue flower in her arms, looking reluctant to give it back to Chen Tao. She said softly, Yanni and I have the same idea, Yanni and I are both yours. We will do whatever you want us to do. Nia will be very obedient. Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but blink his eyes. He was a little surprised. It hasn't been a few minutes since I came to this world, and two exotic beauties were given away for free? Is this world so interesting? Chen Tao was a little helpless. He said, just because of two flowers, you agreed. Yanni looked at Chen Tao and said, for you, it may be just two flowers, but for Nia and me, it means something different. In our tribe, it is an honor to be given a warrior flower by a warrior. For us, it is a supreme honor. Yanni looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, with this flower, our status in the tribe will be much higher, and many people will not dare to bully us. Hearing this, Chen Tao did not expect that this flower would have such an effect. He subconsciously looked at Nia. Nia looked at the blue flower, and her eyes were shining. It can be seen that for Nia, this flower should be of extraordinary significance. Chen Tao said, this is the custom of your tribe, but if this is the case, then those so-called warriors can use these flowers to find anyone to do bad things. Isn't that too much? Yanni was stunned. She looked at Chen Tao and said, it's not that simple. Look at the places where the warrior flowers grow. Those places are so scary. Our warriors will only go to pick them at the cost of their lives. For the warrior flowers, many people paid their lives but couldn't pick them. Yanni said, the cliffs where the warrior flowers grow are very slippery and steep. There is no way to standing and so on. It is already amazing to be able to pick it once and not die. Yanni continued, if the warrior had not thought of paying the price of his life for that woman, it would be impossible to pick the warrior flower. Few people dare to pick the second flower after picking the first one. At present, I know that there is only one person who did this in our tribe. But those 2 times were also very, very dangerous. Yanni smiled, of course, it seems not that difficult for you. It's so strange, how did you do it just now, what is that thing? Yanni looked at Chen Tao curiously. Hearing this, Chen Tao touched the back of his head and said, it's actually about writing code to change the code in the air, and then using the code to pick the flowers out of the air and bring them here. Yanni blinked her eyes, and Nia looked at Chen Tao with some confusion on her little face. Don't understand, they don't understand at all. The civilization of this world can currently only be regarded as the Cold Weapon Age, perhaps even further forward than the Cold Weapon Age. They know many, many things, but they don't understand them. It's no wonder that Yanni and Nia can't understand. After all, they have no basic knowledge at all. What is code? Use code to write, are you talking about that? Yanni asked curiously. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled bitterly, I'll explain this later. What will you do next? When Yanni heard this, she smiled, we plan to take you back first and tell our parents about this. After that, we can leave with you. Leave together? Chen Tao touched the back of his head. He looked at Yanni and said with a smile, your parents probably won't agree. This is what Chen Tao thinks. No parent would throw away their daughter just because of a flower. This is an opportunity for Yanni and Nia to retreat from the difficulties. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 395. Although Chen Tao doesn't know what the family customs are in this world, at present, most civilized parents have the instinct to protect their children. Most of the births of highly intelligent beings are genetically constituted and adopt a viviparous method, and in viviparous civilizations, parents exist. Most parents have the instinct to protect their children. It is an instinct produced by a species for the reproduction of the species. In this case, the parents of Nia and Yanni know about this. Will they allow Nia and Yanni to go with Chen Tao? You know, to them, Chen Tao's appearance is exactly that of a monster. They would safely hand over their children to a monster, right? Thinking of this, Chen Tao smiled and said, okay, I'll go with you. Yanni hummed playfully and said, that's what it should be. Then come with us to the tribe. I'll lead the way. With that said, Yanni walked forward. Chen Tao took steps to keep up with Yanni. Yanni jumped up and down as she walked, and the dark blue tail that looked like a fox behind her slowly swayed with her movements. It can be seen that Yanni is in a good mood. Chen Tao looked at Nia beside him. Nia followed Chen Tao obediently. She treasured the blue flower in her arms. She looked forward, her eyes wide under her long and narrow eyelashes. She has a very hot figure, but unlike her figure, her personality seems to be quieter and not as lively as Yanni. Well, what's your name? Yanni's voice came. Chen Tao looked at Yanni and saw Yanni looking at Chen Tao with big eyes, filled with doubts and curiosity. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled, Chen Tao, my name is Chen Tao. Yanni's eyes glowed with a hint of luster, and she said, Chen Tao, it's not quite like our name here. But it's quite easy to pronounce, and I remember it. She smiled, my man's name is Chen Tao. Seeing Yanni's reaction, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. This girl. However, Chen Tao didn't expect that he would end up in such a situation if he just sent flowers. Chen Tao put this issue aside for the time being. Followed Yanni and Nia out of the forest and entered a valley. The sight that caught his eye made Chen Tao's eyebrows stretch slightly. This is a cave. This is a valley with winding streams and a pool. Directly above you can see the waterfall flowing down. The waterfall fell on the pool with splashes of water. This scenery can be said to be majestic and very ornamental. But Chen Tao's attention was not on the waterfall. His eyes fell on the mountains in those valleys. One cave after another has been carved out of the mountain. In front of the entrance of the cave, someone was walking. There are many people in the valley who look like Yanni, with complexion. It seems that these people all live in this cave. Directly use the mountain to dig a cave as a residence. Living in a cave is really primitive. As soon as Chen Tao came in, all those people's eyes fell on Chen Tao. They looked directly at Chen Tao with a hint of doubt in their expressions. Look, what Yanni and Nia are holding. Suddenly, a girl noticed what Yanni and Nia were holding. It's the flower of warriors. Flower of warriors. All of a sudden, the girls nearby couldn't help but look at the things in Yanni and Nia's hands. Really, who is it? Which warrior gave it to them? I don't know, I haven't heard of it. It must be that guy. I feel like that guy looks so strange, his skin is completely different from ours. Have no idea. Several girls were gathering together next to them, and they were talking about each other. When Yanni heard this, she smiled, then walked to Chen Tao, took Chen Tao's arm, then looked at the girls and said, "Yes, you guessed it right. He gave me my warrior's flower, his name is Chen Tao, he is a warrior, he can knock a beast away casually, and he can also easily pick the warrior flower." When the girls heard this, there was a hint of envy in their eyes, and they all looked at the side with expressions full of envy. Yanni smiled and held Chen Tao's arm. Under the gaze of these envious eyes, Yanni took Chen Tao to a cave. Yanni looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "This is my home." Chen Tao nodded slightly. Yanni smiled and said, "Come in." She let go of Chen Tao and entered the cave on her own. As soon as she entered the cave, Yanni immediately shouted, "Abba, my man is here." Hearing Yanni's happy voice, Chen Tao couldn't help but stretch his eyebrows. If a girl brought a man back to Chen Tao, no one would be worried that their parents would not like her. But Yanni, on the other hand, just said it directly when she entered the house, and she was so cheerful. Chen Tao looked at Nia, who was looking over here. When she looked over, she happened to catch Chen Tao's gaze. Nia's face glowed slightly with a hint of blue, and she looked away, not daring to look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Nia's shy look, and he felt that Nia was quite cute. He smiled and said, "Go in." When Nia heard this, she hummed. The two of them entered the cave together. As soon as he entered the cave, Chen Tao saw Yanni coming out of the cave hall. Behind Yanni, there was a man with dark blue skin. The man was strong, with long dark blue hair tied up, revealing a resolute face and a hearty smile on his face. When he saw Chen Tao, he was slightly startled at first. After Yanni came out, she turned around and walked to Chen Tao. She raised her hand and hugged Chen Tao's arm. She looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Dad, it was he who gave me the warrior flower. I have agreed, so you should bless us well." When the man heard this, his eyes lit up slightly. He looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, Okay. I didn't expect that our Yanni would be favored by the warriors." The man looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "My name is Neil, thank you for wanting my daughter." Chen Tao was stunned. "This, is it? And thank Chen Tao for wanting his daughter? What does it mean?" Chen Tao saw the man's reaction just now. When Neil saw Chen Tao for the first time, Neil's face changed a little. But when Neil heard what Yanni said, his face was full of smiles. In other words, it was that flower. Just because Chen Tao gave the warrior flower to Yanni, Neil, who knew about this, allowed Chen Tao to attack his daughter, and was grateful to Chen Tao. It seems that this is the custom of this place, but this custom is too good, right? Just a flower can capture such a delicate girl. Tao, my father is talking to you. Suddenly a voice came. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao was startled, and he looked at Neil. Neil smiled brightly and said, "It's late, and I happen to get a wild deer today. Do you want to eat here?" You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 396. Chen Tao understood what Neil meant. Neil was planning to keep them for dinner. But, why did Chen Tao find this statement strange? Neil's meaning was obviously to tie Chen Tao and Yanni together. He said you directly. And asked Chen Tao and Yanni if they would stay for dinner? What does that mean? This means that Yanni can choose not to stay for dinner, which means that Neil completely regards Yanni as Chen Tao's person and has nothing to do with him. Chen Tao was a little confused by Neil's way of speaking. Before Chen Tao could answer, Yanni on the side spoke first. "No, Dad, we still have to go to Nia's place tonight." As she said that, Yanni handed the warrior flower to Neil. Seeing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but look at Yanni. Was he saying this directly? Was he telling his father-in-law that he was cheating on her? At this time, Neil raised his hand and took it. He smiled and said, "Okay, then you go." Neil was still smiling. Chen Tao opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but he couldn't say anything. In other words, this civilization cannot be explained by the Earth civilization where Chen Tao is. For the civilization on Yanni's side, it may not be strange to have a few beauties around. Then, let's go. Yanni looked at Chen Tao, gave Chen Tao a playful smile, and said, "I know where Nia's house is, let's go there." Yeah, Chen Tao responded. Chen Tao took Nia and followed Yanni forward. "You just gave the flowers to your father." Chen Tao looked at Yanni and said, "Aren't you going to keep them?" Yanni looked at Chen Tao and smiled playfully. "We don't need to keep these flowers, just give them to my father. My father will put the flowers at the door. When others see them, they will know that someone wants me, and the person who wants me is a warrior. In this way, my father and I will be respected by the people in the tribe. So that's how it is. This place is quite interesting." Hello. Suddenly, a childish lowly voice sounded in Chen Tao's head. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. "It's Betty." Chen Tao responded, "Baby, are you awake?" On the other side, in the bedroom, Betty was wearing a thin shirt, sitting at the dining table, cutting steak and eating, while she looked at the picture in front of her. In that picture, it was the picture of Chen Tao, Yanni, and Yanni. Betty said, "I'm awake, eating breakfast, and looking at you." Chen Tao's heart moved, and his mouth twitched. Betty's jealous ability is the most jealous among Chen Tao's girls. This is troublesome. Betty whispered in her unique lowly voice, "What? Do you still want to add sisters to us?" Chen Tao touched the back of his head, a little embarrassed. "Humph!" Betty snorted and stopped talking. "Baby," Chen Tao gently called Betty in the Gene channel. But Betty didn't speak. Chen Tao touched his nose. It seems that Betty is really angry. Chen Tao looked at Yanni, who was happily jumping in front of him, and then he looked at Nia beside him. Yanni was very happy, and Nia's face was slightly blue, and her narrow eyelashes and eyes also showed a hint of joy. This civilization seems to be a very special civilization. For Yanni and Nia, these two flowers are enough to change their fate. Because accepting the flowers means that they already regard themselves as Chen Tao's people. Chen Tao never thought that he would send flowers and such a situation would happen. However, Chen Tao never thought about doing anything to Yanni and Nia. He just sent flowers. But looking at their happy and expectant looks, if Chen Tao told them the truth, wouldn't it be too cruel? And Yanni had already told her father, and judging from Yanni's father's intention, he was completely planning to throw Yanni out. In this case, if Yanni was told the truth, what would Yanni do? And would her father agree to let her stay at home? These are all problems. Chen Tao felt a little overwhelmed. Chen Tao stopped. Seeing Chen Tao stop, Yanni was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "What's wrong?" Nia saw Chen Tao stop. She also looked puzzled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "That. You don't mean to say that you want the flowers, but you just want to send them, so you don't want us, right?" Yanni spoke first. Chen Tao was stunned. Yanni puffed up her little face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "I don't care, we are yours since you sent the warrior flower. No matter what you thought at the time, and you saw my father, he has already determined that I am yours. If you throw me home, my father will feel ashamed and won't let me go home. I will starve to death." Yanni's big eyes were full of tears, and she looked at Chen Tao with a wronged face. Chen Tao opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. "Tao, do you regret it?" a soft voice came. Chen Tao looked at Nia beside him, and Nia looked at Chen Tao, with tears in her eyes. Seeing this, Chen Tao was silent for a while. He raised his hand and slowly wiped the tears from Nia's face. He said gently, "That's not what I meant." What to do? Chen Tao found that he was too indecisive. It was because of his softness and indecision that he had more and more beauties around him. Speaking of it, the result was good. But, really, it can't continue to increase. This is not a good thing. Softness is a disease. Chen Tao chose a method that was not so tough. He looked at Nia and smiled, "I just thought of something. I have to do it, so I need to leave for a while." "Then you take us with you," Yanni said. Upon hearing this, Chen Tao shook his head and said, "That thing is very dangerous. It is possible that I will not come here in the future, so I can't take you with me." "Is it so dangerous?" Yanni's eyes were filled with uneasiness. She hurried to Chen Tao and held Chen Tao's hand. "Then I have to go with you even more. I will die by your side. You are my man, and we are yours now. We can't live without you." Looking at Yanni's reaction, Chen Tao's heart moved slightly. He was a little moved. "I want to go too," Nia also spoke. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Nia. He thought about it and said, "No, it's too dangerous. I can't take both of you with me." Tao Yanni was a little worried. Chen Tao said, "I don't want anything to happen to you." "Well." Yanni bit her lip and said, "I understand. If we go, we will only become a burden. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 397. Looking at Yanni's depressed mood, Chen Tao raised his hand and stroked her dark blue hair. He said gently, "Okay, don't worry, I will be fine. I will be back in a while." Before that, Chen Tao looked at Yanni and said, "You too, just live here." As he said, Chen Tao slightly turned sideways and raised his hand. In front of Chen Tao was a primitive forest. But when Chen Tao raised his hand, the woods in front turned into dots of blue light and disappeared. With the blue light on, a two-story villa appeared in front of the three people. Writing a villa is much simpler than writing a star. Yanni and Nia's eyes widened, their faces full of disbelief. What is this?" Yanni came to her senses and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled, "Home, this will be our home. Come on, I'll take you in to see." Chen Tao pushed open the gate of the yard in front and entered the yard. "Walk through the yard." Walking along the bluestone road, we walked to the door of the house. Chen Tao looked back at Yanni and Nia. The two girls were looking around, their eyes were full of surprise. Looking at the expressions of the two girls, Chen Tao smiled, then looked in one direction, and said, "Do you see the tree over there?" Yanni and Yanni followed Chen Tao's line of sight and looked. Over there was a tree growing in the yard. The tree was full of fruits. Seeing this, Yanni and Nia's eyes lit up slightly. Yanni looked at Chen Tao and said, "What kind of fruit tree is that? I have never seen it before." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "That tree is called the everlasting fruit tree. I named it. Eating one of the fruits on it can make people full for a day and also get the nutrients they need for a day. More importantly, the tree will grow indefinitely. As long as you pick a fruit, it will continue to grow. For example," he raised his hand. A fruit on the fruit tree was picked by an invisible force and flew into Chen Tao's hands. After the fruit was picked, a flower slowly grew from the place where it was picked, and the flower slowly produced a fruit. In the blink of an eye, the place where it was picked was replaced by a new fruit. Seeing this, Yanni and Nia were both stunned. Chen Tao handed the fruit to Nia. Nia was startled, and she raised her little hand to take it. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Try it." Yeah, Nia took a bite. Nia's eyes lit up slightly when she took a bite. "How is it? Is it delicious?" Yanni was also very curious about the taste of the fruit on this magical fruit tree. Nia nodded repeatedly. She looked at Yanni and said, "So sweet, so delicious." Yanni's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Tao, I want one too." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao smiled. He raised his hand, got another one, and handed it to Yanni. Yanni held it in her small hands and took a bite. Her eyes lit up slightly. "It's delicious, really delicious." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Will this fruit tree continue to grow fruit?" Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly. Yanni pursed her thin lips and said, "If the fruit is given to the people in the tribe, then the companions in the tribe don't have to risk hunting or go to those terrible forests to collect food every day." She looked at Chen Tao with expectation in her eyes. Chen Tao shook his head. He looked at Yanni and said, "I know what you mean, but this won't work." Yanni was startled. She said, "Okay." Chen Tao looked at Yanni's somewhat lost and puzzled look. Chen Tao smiled. He raised his hand, stroked Yanni's hair, and said, "Go into the house and take a look." Yeah, Yanni nodded repeatedly. Chen Tao pushed the door open. Yanni and Nia went into the house together. Chen Tao looked back at the everlasting fruit tree. In fact, this fruit tree was just something Chen Tao thought of making temporarily. The immortal fruit tree was actually just something Chen Tao thought of making temporarily. Chen Tao planned to leave here, but he didn't want Yanni and Nia to have no place to live, nor did he want them to starve to death. Now that there is a place to live, the problem of food needs to be solved, and this immortal fruit tree is a tree that Chen Tao wrote using the method of making conceptual armor and conceptual weapons to produce fruit infinitely. In this way, Yanni and Nia's stomach problem was solved. So big, so wide. What are these chairs? Ah, so soft. Yanni seemed very excited. When Chen Tao entered the house, he saw Yanni sitting on the sofa, closing her eyes, and looking very happy, so comfortable. Seeing Yanni's lazy look, he couldn't help but smile. Nia was very well behaved. She stood and looked around. There was curiosity and surprise in her eyes, but no one told Nia that she could sit, and Nia didn't dare to sit casually. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Nia, sit wherever you want. This will be your and Yanni's home from now on. You can live here. The immortal fruit tree outside can solve your stomach problems. You are safe here." Yanni and Nia looked at each other, and Yanni looked at Chen Tao and said, "Are you leaving?" The sharp Yanni immediately realized what Chen Tao meant. Nia looked at Chen Tao. her eyes shining with a hint of uneasiness and worry. She seemed a little depressed. Looking at the expressions of the two women, Chen Tao said, "Well, so I left this for you, a place to stay and possibly food to eat?" Nia pursed her thin lips, looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes, and said, "Will you come back?" Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at Nia's uneasy expression. Chen Tao originally didn't want to come back. He just wanted to stall for time. After a long time, they would like someone else, and then it would be over. But seeing Nia's expression, Chen Tao hesitated for a moment. He said softly, "Well, I'll be back." Nia's eyes lit up slightly, she pursed her lips, and there was a slight smile on her face. "Don't worry, Nia," Yanni said with a smile, "he is so magical and powerful that he can conjure such big things out of thin air. Is there anything else he can't do? He will come back after he finishes his work. We don't want him to worried." Hearing what Yanni said, Chen Tao was still a little ashamed. Nia hummed, her expression relaxed a lot, and there was a smile on her face. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Then Yanni and I are waiting for you to come back." Chen Tao hoped that the two of them would not wait for him. But hearing what they said, Chen Tao could only nodded slightly, and he smiled and said, "Okay." Chen Tao said, "Then, I'm leaving." Yes, Nia looked at Chen Tao with a glint in her eyes. Chen Tao's figure slowly disappeared from their sight. Looking at the place where Chen Tao disappeared, Nia had no time to be surprised before she was covered in emotions of decline. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 398. In this way, Chen Tao doesn't have to worry about what will happen to Yanni and Nia. We have accommodation and food. Their two life problems have been solved. Now they just need to wait. As time goes by, they will fall in love with someone else, and then they can get away. Being soft-hearted is a disease. Chen Tao looked back and thought, if he hadn't saved Nia at that time and sent her flowers, nothing would have happened in the future. Now Chen Tao needs to speak out and make it clear to Nia and Yanni that it is too cruel for those two girls who are immersed in joy. With Chen Tao's character, he really couldn't do such a thing. This is the only choice. Chen Tao put away his emotions, returned to base 1, and appeared in the restaurant of base 1. He saw Betty sitting at the dining table, eating breakfast. Betty's breakfast was always steak. Betty was wearing a thin shirt. The white shirt was very clean and fair, and was relatively delicately made. At the hem of the shirt, her legs were slender and straight, as white as cream, and crystal clear. Compared to the shirt she wore, it was whiter and more delicate, with no pores visible. Her long red hair was draped casually behind Betty, like a waterfall, ending abruptly at her waist. She is petite and has a slender waist. The sunlight from the window filtered in and fell on Betty, her clear skin glowing with luster. Indulging in the delicious food and bathing in the sun, she was extremely beautiful. Chen Tao looked at Betty in front of him, smiled and walked over. "Master," a voice came from the side. It was number 1. Number 1 looked at Chen Tao with a smile. The voice of number 1 comes together. Betty's ears twitched and she looked towards Chen Tao. Those ruby eyes looked at Chen Tao. Betty snorted, looked away, and ignored Chen Tao. You could tell Betty was angry. No wonder she was angry. The man bullied her all day yesterday, which made her exhausted. As a result, when she got up in the morning, she saw Chen Tao making out with other girls somewhere else. It would be weird not to be angry. Looking at Betty's puffed up cheeks, she looked sulky. Chen Tao smiled and stepped closer to Betty. Betty has lived for a long time, but she still has the same temper as a little girl. Betty had zero experience with relationships between men and women. She had no choice but to use the same method as the little girl. Chen Tao approached Betty from behind and took Betty into his arms along with the chair. "Let go," Betty muttered. A symbolic struggle. Chen Tao got close to Betty's neck, smelled her hair, then got close to her cheek, and rubbed his face against hers. Betty's bulging cheeks were suppressed by Chen Tao's approach. Let go. Betty's face turned red and she resisted delicately, using that unique Lolita tone. Chen Tao smiled, kissed her cheek, and said with a smile, "Are you jealous?" Again, "Really, who would be jealous of you?" Betty's eyes glowed with a glint, and she said, "Who do you think you are? Why should I be jealous?" Chen Tao smiled, and he picked up Betty. He sat on the chair where Betty had just been sitting, and put Betty in his arms. Betty's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She lightly pursed her thin lips and looked at Chen Tao with her moving eyes. Chen Tao met Betty's gaze, he smiled, his eyes fell on her thin lips, and then he slowly moved closer to her cheek. Betty looked away, not looking at Chen Tao, and also avoided Chen Tao's kiss. Looking at Betty's actions, Chen Tao blinked. Betty said softly, "Where are the two girls? She still cares." Chen Tao smiled and said, "I didn't go there to pick up girls." When Betty heard this, she looked at Chen Tao, "You've already courted them, aren't you just trying to pick up girls?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "I'm not asking for love. The reason why I went there is actually to save people. I only gave flowers because I saw that they wanted them very much. But I didn't expect that. They still have that kind of custom." Betty frowned, "Then you can't make it clear? You still go with them to meet their elders, really?" Hearing what Chen Tao said, Betty's anger subsided a little. Chen Tao said, "There is no way. Who told your husband to be so kind? For us, it is just a flower, but for them, it is something that can affect their destiny." He looked at Betty and said, looking at their smiling faces, "I really can't say anything too cruel." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "Admit it, you are just a playboy. Even though I am by your side, you still go to see other girls. You don't want them." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, "You will misunderstand this." He gently put his hand around Betty's slender waist and hugged her into his arms. He looked into Betty's eyes and said with a smile, I've said it before, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to bear it when I looked at you, so I chose to divert my attention. Otherwise." Chen Tao looked at Betty and said with a smile, "I'm afraid I might accidentally continue the exercise with you last night." Betty's face turned slightly red, and she gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes, but because of these words, she behaved and slowly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. In other words, "You really didn't mean to find another girl, just left me." Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "Yes, I promise." Betty raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "What about them? What should you do?" Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "I'll leave them there." "Leave them there?" Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, "Didn't you just say that your flower is of such importance to them? Now that they are yours, just leave them there. Are you too cruel?" Chen Tao blinked and looked at Betty. She was the one who was jealous, and she was the one who said Chen Tao was cruel. "I really can't see what this girl is thinking." Chen Tao said, "Well, that's true. Then I can bring them here and be your sister, okay?" Betty was startled, then she puffed her face and said, "How dare you?" She was angry again. Chen Tao smiled, "Okay, okay." He hugged her, gently held her legs with his hands, and pulled her closer to his arms. All of a sudden, Betty's little face turned red. "What are you doing? Really, if you don't come back, forget it. If you come back, you will bully others." Chen Tao said with a smile, "That's what I thought. I gave them a place to live, solved their food problem, and then told them that I had important things to do. After a while, they changed their minds and like another man. Then I can quit that civilization and let this matter go." Betty pursed her thin lips. "Is this so? It still feels a bit cruel." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 399. Chen Tao looked at Betty's expression. He came close to Betty's face and leaned his forehead against Betty's. He leaned down and kissed her parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Betty. Betty's ruby eyes were glowing with water. She looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao smiled, stood up, and hugged Betty. Holding Betty in his arms, he walked towards the bedroom. Betty's face turned red and she couldn't help but hide her little head in Chen Tao's arms. Entered the bedroom. Chen Tao put Betty on the bed and leaned against her. The two faces are close at hand. Betty's cheeks were red, and her eyes looked into Chen Tao's eyes, filled with blurred moisture. Chen Tao covered Betty's cheek with his big hands and said, "Sure enough, I still don't want you to get out of bed." Betty's eyes were filled with moisture. She turned her face slightly and muttered, "Big bad guy, Lolakan." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile, leaned down and kissed her. Betty had nothing to do with Chen Tao, she just closed her eyes subconsciously. Meanwhile, on the other side. At noon. Pei Ai was sitting in the restaurant eating lunch. In the restaurant, people were coming and going. Pei Ai was in the corner, holding a spoon and eating today's lunch, applesauce. Looking at the applesauce in front of him, Pei Ai's mind was not at all on the food. If he were here, he would definitely not be willing to let me eat only applesauce. Pei Ai held a spoon and turned it in the applesauce. She said leisurely, "I haven't seen him for a day. I don't know if he wants to." Speaking of this, Pei Ai's face turned red. "What am I thinking about? It's only been a day and do you already miss him?" Pei Ai blushed. Pei Ai blushed even more when he thought of the things Chen Tao always did when he met her. Pei Ai shook his head, throwing all the random thoughts behind him, and then continued to eat lunch. Pei Ai, a voice came. When Pei Ai heard this, she raised her face and saw that it was Dimanche coming over. With a smile on her face, Timensa walked over and said, "Can I sit across from you?" Pei Ai quickly stood up, saluted Dimanche, and said, "Commander." When Timensa heard this, she smiled and said, "You don't have to speak to me like this when you are outside. Just call me by my name. Call me Timensa." Pei Ai's eyes glowed, a smile appeared on her face, and she sat down. Pei Ai looked at Dimanche in front of him. Timanza sat down opposite Pei Ai and placed the dinner plate on the table. Looking at Dimanche in front of him, Pei Ai had envy in his eyes. Dimanche has a really good figure, her waist is plump, her figure is well organized, and she is flawlessly beautiful. What Pei Ai envied the most was Dimanche's proud bust. That curvature is something Pei Ai doesn't have, and it is also something Pei Ai envies. Dimanche has slightly curly golden hair, and she exudes the unique temperament of a leader. That is the leadership quality that Pei Ai does not have. All this makes Pei Ai envious, which is something she doesn't have. Timanza was eating her lunch, and she looked at Pei Ai. Just in time to catch Pei Ai's gaze. Pei Ai was startled, her face turned slightly red, she looked away and was eating her lunch. For Pei Ai, a being like Dimanche is a superior being. In the past, Pei Ai would only meet with Dimanche when doing tasks. He rarely talked to Dimanche. The only person who usually talked to Dimanche was Pei Ai's captain and Cheng. Pei Aiman admires Dimanche. And now that Dimanche is the commander, she is Pei Ai's boss's boss. Pei Ai was naturally happy to see the person he admired sitting in front of him eating. Timantha smiled. She looked away and ate her lunch. She said, "I didn't see that person with you yesterday." Pei Ai was slightly startled and looked at Dimanche. She was a little confused at first, but then she came back to her senses and knew that Dimancha was talking about Chen Tao. Pai said, he left, probably going home. Go home, Dimansa looked at Pai and said, where is his home? Before, Pai and Dimancha thought that Chen Tao's home was outside the wall, and that Chen Tao was a person from outside the territory. They were not wrong, and they were considered wrong. They were not wrong because Chen Tao was indeed from outside the territory, but what they did not expect at the time was that Chen Tao was not only from outside the territory, but also from outside this planet, so they were also considered wrong. So, where is Chen Tao's home? Pai pursed her lower lip and said, he told me that his home is on another planet, and there are people like us living there. The only difference is that there is no virus on that planet, and there are no monsters. People are happy there. Pai looked at Dimansa and said, he has gone home and is probably on that planet now. Hearing this, Dimancha's eyes glowed, and she smiled and said, is that God's planet? Pai blinked and said, well, according to him, it's a planet with relatively advanced technology. It's different from us. Timanza nodded slightly. Pai looked at Dimancha. She had seen Chen Tao and Dimancha together before, but Pai was still not sure about the relationship between Dimancha and Chen Tao. But when Pai thought about it, it seemed that when Chen Tao came here, he had been by her side all the time, so it should be impossible for anything to happen to Dimancha. But Dimancha is now the commander. Logically speaking, nothing should happen between Chen Tao and Dimancha. Pai didn't think much about it and continued to eat. Pai suddenly, Dimancha's voice came from the side. Pai raised her head and looked at Dimancha. Dimancha was looking at Pai, with a hearty smile on her face. She slowly put down the spoon, then put her hands together, looked straight into Pai's eyes and said with a smile, are you willing to be my sister? Pai was slightly startled, she looked at Dimancha, she was slightly stunned. Sister, this word, Pai has never heard in her life. Because everyone in the Holy Land knows that the word sister is taboo. Family relationships are all prohibited by the Holy Land. This is a complete violation of the Holy Land rules and is punishable by death. Pai never thought that she would hear the same words from Dimancha, the commander. Dimansa smiled and said, the rules of the Holy Land are being revised. One of them is to restore people's kinship, including father and son, parents, etc., including sisters. Dimansa looked at Pai seriously and said with a smile, kinship does not necessarily have to be blood-related. Like us, we can also become sworn sisters, sisters without blood ties. Dimansa looked at Pai seriously and said with a smile, are you willing? Pai opened her mouth slightly, her eyes were shining, and she immediately smiled and said, I am willing. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 400. Timanza is the person Pai admires, and the person she admires is now her sister, which makes Pai excited and surprised. Faced with such a situation, how could Pai refuse? Seeing Pai's surprised look, Dimancha had a smile on her face. She said, I've read your information. I'm older than you, so you can call me sister from now on. Pai hummed, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes filled with joy. Dimancha looked at Pai and smiled and said, then, give me a shout. Pai was startled. She hesitated for a moment and looked at Dimansa. She was a little excited, and her waist undulated slightly due to her excitement. She pursed her thin lips slightly, looked at Dimancha with her big eyes, and said softly, sister. The voice was very hesitant, but she still said it without speaking loudly. But the small voice made Dimansa's eyes soften. Timanza smiled. She looked at Pai and said, you called me sister, so I have something to ask you. Pai's eyes glowed with luster. She looked at Dimancha and said, what's the matter? She was a little curious, What would Demantia want to ask her? Dimunsa looked at Pai seriously, and she said softly, "That's right, I want to ask you, as your sister, but, I did something wrong, will you forgive me?" Pai's eyes were filled with luster, and she looked at Dimunsa. "Did you do something wrong?" Timanza nodded seriously. She looked at Pai and said, "Yes, I did something wrong. But I want you to forgive me, I hope you can forgive me. As for that matter, I want you to forgive me, I'll tell you later." Looking at Dimunsa's serious and dignified expression, Pai was slightly startled. The wrong thing that Timantha would do as a commander? Pai was a little nervous. Could it be about the survival of the sanctuary? Pai frowned, and her expression became a little more nervous. She looked at Demantia. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but hesitated for a moment. She looked at Timanza seriously and said, "No matter what you did wrong, sister, I forgive you. I believe in your judgment." Seeing Pai's serious look, Demantia's eyes lit up slightly. She smiled, stretched out her hand, and held Pai's hand holding the spoon. She looked at Pai and said with a smile, "Good sister, you are really good." Pai looked at her hand that was being held. Her face turned slightly red. She looked at Timensa and said, "Sister." Pai was still not used to this voice, but she was very serious. The person Pai admires the most is Dimantia, and she trusts Dimantia's judgment. Dimantia looked into Pai's eyes. She smiled, which was rare. Even Dimantia, who had always been very courageous, had a blush on her face. She looked at Pai and said, "That's it, Chentao and I already have that kind of relationship." That kind of relationship? Pai was stunned for a moment. She blinked. Dimantia looked at Pai. She slowly let go of her hand. She looked at Pai and said, "I know that feelings can make people possessive. You are the first one to be with Chentao, I think to you, he is yours. But I stepped in, I think it was my mistake." She looked at Pai, a little apologetically, and said, "I'm a little ashamed, but Chentao is very charming and I can't resist him." Dimantia looked at Pai and said softly, "I just want to ask you to forgive me." She looked at Pai seriously, and there was no smile on her face, but she was serious and dignified. Pai blinked and smiled, "So it's just like this. Is that all?" Timanza looked at Pai. Pai looked at Dimantia, stretched out her hand, and held Pai's hand. She looked at Dimantia seriously and said, "I thought it was a major matter related to the survival of the sanctuary. In fact, when it comes to feelings, I don't understand, I don't know what possessiveness is, but if I can become sisters with you because of this, I think that would be great." Pai is a blank slate when it comes to love. It can be said that she learned everything about love from Chentao. She didn't know what possessiveness was. Although hearing about Chentao's relationship with Dimantia made her feel sad, she didn't think much about it. Reason told her that this matter was nothing. And being able to become sisters with the commander she had always admired was a good thing for her. So Pai accepted it naturally. Seeing Pai accepting it easily, there was a smile on Pai's face, and she said, "Thank you." When Pai heard this, her eyes glowed, and she smiled and said, "It's nothing. You are my sister. You don't need to thank me for this kind of thing. And this matter is his choice, and I can't say no. And the result is pretty good. You have become my sister, in fact, Sister Dimantia, I have always admired you." Pai looked at Dimantia and said, "Ever since I became a warrior, I have been learning from you, sister." At this point, Pai's face turned red. Timanza blinked her eyes, smiled, and slowly retracted her hand, saying, "No matter what, I feel guilty about you, and I am quite nervous to confess to you. I feel relieved when I hear you say that." Pai hummed and smiled. You guys had a lot of fun chatting. Suddenly, a voice came. Hearing this familiar voice, Dimanche and Pai suddenly moved, and they looked at the source of the sound at the same time. There was a woman sitting over there, and that woman was the girl Jenna. Jenna crossed her legs and sat aside, minding her own food. Jenna continued to sit and talk with them. Such a scene made Dimanche and Pai's eyes glow with a hint of luster. Pai thought of something. Jenna manages the laws of the sanctuary. She must have heard the conversation here since she was sitting there. And the conversation here involves the relationship between sisters. Sisterhood was prohibited by previous fertility laws. Does Jenna care about this matter? Thinking of this, Pai frowned and said lightly, the past laws of the sanctuary are outdated, and now sister relationships are allowed. Why do you still want to care about this? Upon hearing this, Jenna's hand holding the spoon paused. Her face, which had always been expressionless, still had no expression. I didn't know what Jenna was thinking. Jenna crossed her legs, held a spoon, and turned the spoon on applesauce. She said slowly, the new rules haven't been established yet. Are you two a little too hasty like this?